Yeah. So hello everyone. Hey from IC department, and today I'm going to give a presentation about understanding the impacts of COVID-19 policies on subjective well-being. So this work is guided by my advisor, Professor Mayank Kejriwal. So you have heard a lot about COVID-19. So the effects of COVID-19 are not only limited to the destruction of people's physical health, but also the mental health and subjective well-being. So many previous research has shown that women and teenagers suffer a lot during the pandemic in the early stage, and we find that part of the negative impacts on people's mental health and subjective well-being come from the COVID-19 restrictions or say policies such as school closing. So some previous research find that most students experience social isolation and loneliness during the school closing period. However, the relationship between different COVID-19 policies and subjective well-being are not clear. So before we jump into my research, so the first questions that I want to clarify is the definition of subjective well-being. So SWB is defined as how people experience their lives in positive ways. So there are many ways to represent SWB, and the most commonly used one is a global life satisfaction index, which usually can be formed as a life ladder question. So given this ladder with steps number from 0 to 10, so the top of this ladder, it means the best possible life for you, and the bottom is the worst possible life, which is also 0. So the question is, given this ladder, on which step that you feel you personally stand at this time. So in this way, we can get a numerized representation of SWB. So go back to the COVID-19 policies. They were intended as beneficial health interventions. However, we find that some policies affect the social sentiments than others. So our research question is, what the impact of these COVID-19 policies on subjective well-being? And as we mentioned before, that female and teenagers are suffering more during the pandemic. So for people with different demographics, so for example, young versus old, what's the policy's impact on their subjective well-being? So the research questions that we investigated in our overall project, including to what extent do COVID-19 policies impact SWB of men and women differently, and how does the work from home policy impact people's SWB during the pandemic? And we also have results about, so when we control people's professions and political affiliations, what are the conditional effects of different policies on their subjective well-being? But due to the time limit, we will not go to that result. We only focus on the results of the first two questions. So we collect some individual level demographic variables and also people's SWB responses from Gallup panel COVID-19 survey from March 2020 to August 2020, which is exactly the early period of the pandemic. And we also collect some state level policy measures from the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker. So this can be applied to people living in that state, so we can concatenate these two data sets together. And after some tedious but a little bit complex data processing, we get the policy measures, COVID hospitalization variables, the demographics such as gender, income as our independent variables, and also the individual SWB as our dependent variable. This comes from Gallup dataset. So we feed these variables into a tree structure regression model called conditional inference tree, and output will become will review that what's the most important predictors in determining people's SWB, and what's the conditional effects of COVID-19 policies and many demographic variables on the SWB. So now let's get more details about results. So the original result tree are very big, so I just show part of them here. So you can see that the income is the most important predictor when we want to determine the SWB of people. So you can see that the SWB of high income people, low income, and the middle income are significantly different. And for the high income people, they really care about workplace closing. So when they were asked to, work from home and all workplaces are closing by the required by government at all levels, their SWB will be varied in this case. And for the low income people, we find that the SWB of female and male are significant different. So the low-income female are suffering more during the pandemic, which has been supported by other literature too. So to wrap up, we find that the impact of COVID-19 policies on SWB is non-trivial, and it varies among individuals with different demographic variables. And by integrating appropriate data set and use some advanced statistical techniques, we are able to measure the relationships such as those between policy measures and SWB. And we apply this CIT model, and we find many interesting things that can be helpful for the preparedness for the upcoming pandemic. Yeah, that's it.